Hi Philippe, welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. Can you start by telling me a little bit about yourself and your career?
Sure. So I'm a law professor. I teach international law at the University of London at UCL. I'm also a barrister, and I do international cases involving disputes about the environment, natural resources, mass killing, and a whole range of other issues. And on the side, if I've got any time left over, I write books.
And can you tell us a little bit about your book, East-West Street, and how you discovered the stories that are within that?
The book is a very personal book. It's probably the most personal book I've ever written. It's about four men, one of whom is my grandfather, who would never tell me. I knew him very long into his life and long into my life. He died when he was 94. I was in my mid-30s, and he would never talk about what had happened during the war and before the war. So I knew very little about his background, and about 10 years after he died, I received an invitation to give a lecture at a very obscure university in the middle of the Ukraine, in a city called Lviv, on the work that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide, on mass killing. And I accepted to give the lecture because I wanted to see where he was born. And from that grew a story about his life, what had happened. I managed to uncover the mysteries of his life. And I also learned that the city in which he was born was the place where the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity originated as legal concepts. So I sort of melded a very personal story and a very political and intellectual story.
In the book, you talk a lot about genocide and crimes against humanity. Could you explain to me the difference between the two?
The book came out in the summer, and people have been really amazed to learn that both concepts are recent inventions. They were invented, each of them, by two different men. Crimes against humanity by a man called Herschel Lauterpacht, genocide by a man called Raphael Lemkin, and amazingly they both studied at the same university that had invited me to give that lecture, but the university was not aware of that. I uncovered that in the course of researching the lecture that I was going to give there. The essential difference between the two is crimes against humanity is concerned with the protection of individuals, stopping states from killing individuals. Genocide is about the killing of groups and the protection of groups. Every act of genocide is also a crime against humanity, but not every crime against humanity is a genocide. What's the essential difference? To prove a crime against humanity, you have to show that a large number of people have been killed unlawfully and systematically. To prove a genocide, you have to show the same thing, but additionally you have to prove that the acts of killing were motivated by the intention to destroy that group. And that's a very difficult thing to prove.
What personal stories inspire you in your job?
The kinds of stories that inspire me are stories about people who, in the face of tremendous pressures to conform in wrongdoing, act independently and fearlessly in doing the right thing. You might call it expressions of civil courage. In the book, for example, East-West Street, there's one person in particular. Well, there's a number of people who stand out as remarkable individuals. But one in particular is a lady called Miss Tilney. In my grandfather's papers, shown to me by my mother long after he died, I found a scrap of paper which simply said Miss E.M. Tilney, Norwich, Angleterre. And I said to my mum, who is this person? And my mum said, I don't know. And I said, you never wanted to find out? She said, no. I pushed her, and eventually she said, I think actually it might be the person who saved my life. It might be the lady who brought me from Vienna to Paris in the summer of 1939. And I said, you never wanted to find out? She said, no, but if you want to find out, she said, go for it. So I spent 4 years trying to uncover who this individual was. And it turned out she was a truly remarkable lady. She was an evangelical Christian missionary who took it upon herself in the 1930s to save people at risk from persecution and bring them to safety. And she herself, having saved a large number of people, was then arrested and interned and imprisoned in Stalag 127 by the Germans for 4 years, in the course of which she saved further lives by hiding people in her cupboard of her room for 6 months until the camp was liberated by the Americans. And what really distinguishes this extraordinary woman, Elsie Tilney, is that she never told a single person what she had done. I had to reconstitute it 70 years later. Even her own members of her family did not know what she had done to save children and others at risk of persecution. And that's the kind of individual, in the face of so many pressures to conform in horrible behavior, stands against that, rather like the person in that famous photograph, Tiananmen Square, the young Chinese person who stands in front of a tank. She reminds me of that spirit.
Just that resilience in the face of
absolute courage. Doing the right thing when doing the wrong thing is a lot easier.
In our current situation, with so many terror attacks happening almost weekly and the awful refugee crisis, how do you think normality can exist alongside such horrors?
Your question about normality existing alongside such horrors makes me imagine how it must have been to be an ordinary, decent German in the 1930s, and how easy it was to avert one's eyes from what was going on. And it raises the question, are we doing that now? I mean, does a day pass where we don't ask ourselves, what am I actually doing about Iraq, about Syria, about the Congo, about Rwanda? I mean, in a certain sense, I have the privilege of being involved in work that enables me to say, well, at least I'm doing something. But I never really think I'm doing enough. And here I am in wonderful Edinburgh, attending this remarkable book festival where people are going about in security and in comfort, and yet not so far away, truly terrible things happening. But I suppose we have to ask ourselves the question, was it ever any different? And is it simply not that with social media, with communications, we just now are so much more aware of what's going on? And I think one thing, I have children your age and a little bit older, and what I love about your generation is you see all of these things, and yet you retain, as you must retain, a sense of hope and strength and joy, and life has to go on. You can't spend every single day worrying about the horrors that are taking place around us or further away. You have lives, and those lives have to be lived in all of their aspects, the good and the bad, the difficult and the not so difficult. So I think it's normal that life goes on, but I'm sure you and many of your friends and your colleagues in your generation will put a lot of effort into these things that we're talking about. You should, I suppose what I'm saying is you shouldn't feel guilty that you'll go out on a Saturday night and go to a party, because that is your right to do that as a young person. And then on Tuesday you may go on a march about something that's happening in Syria, and that's right that you should have that balance.
Yeah, the balance between acting and living. Yeah. You mentioned social media and how much of an impact it's made on things. Do you think access to the internet has helped or hindered human rights?
Gosh, what a big question.
I know, follows on from my one before.
I think, isn't it surely a bit of both? It's helped, let's take an example of each. It's helped human rights in the sense that it's made it much easier for us to know what is going on in faraway places. I'm thinking of a case that I'm doing in relation to Libya at the International Criminal Court. And the fact that events in 2011 as Gaddafi was being overthrown and turning his guns on his own people was recorded by people on their mobile phones. They took videos and photographs and they texted about it and they did Facebook about it, and we learned what was happening, and that helps in the fight against human rights. On the other hand, we also know that social media, Twitter and Facebook, is used to galvanize forces of darkness, is used to recruit, is used to campaign, and that poses fundamental questions about freedom of expression and what limits, if any, should be placed on the use of social media to communicate ideas that maybe some of us really disagree with.
International human rights issues can sometimes seem really remote. How could someone like a Scottish secondary school pupil get involved?
They're not remote. I mean, they affect each and every one of us. Right now we have a government in the United Kingdom which is talking about and thinking about getting rid of something called the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act, which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law and gives rights to the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged communities based on the principle that every human being, because they are a human being, is entitled to certain minimum rights that cannot be abrogated in any circumstances. That was the silver lining that came out of the Second World War. There were no individual rights. There was no such thing as human rights before 1945. Amazing to do that. Before 1945, a state could kill its own nationals, and there was no rule of international law that said you couldn't do that. And it is going to be for your generation to protect that incredible accomplishment, which is under challenge by attacking the Human Rights Act, and even something like Brexit is effectively, in my view, a means of attacking the settlement that came post-Second World War, which was intended to say every human being has an inherent dignity and an inherent worth that is worthy of protection, irrespective of what they have done. And there's a myriad ways that you can do that, whether it's being involved in groups like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, whether it's going on marches, whether it's writing to your MPs, whether it's writing stories, whether it's singing songs. There's so many different things that you can do, and they really matter. And the one vital message from my book, East-West Street, is that individual choices really matter. You can make a real difference. The two men who invented the concepts of of crimes against humanity and genocide have made a fundamental difference. It wasn't governments who made those differences, it was individuals, and each and every one of you can make a difference.
Thank you. Just one more question. What advice could you give to a 16-year-old who wanted to become an international human rights lawyer?
As I teach at university, and so I often get asked the question, how can we get involved, how can we do that kind of stuff? Firstly, I would say, and this is curious advice, if you're interested in becoming a lawyer, don't do law at university. Do something else. University should be about doing something that you love, truly feel passionate about, science, politics, history, maths, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Do something you love in your first degree. It's the last chance in your life you will get to just do what you love. Then change to law, as you can do, and then probably do a master's in international law or human rights law. And on the basis of that, go and do an internship with a government, with an NGO, with an international organization, with an international court, with a barrister like me, and then things will open. And the one thing that is plain is that human rights law is not going away. It's here to stay, and your generation will be a vital generation in taking it to the next stage. So what I say to my students who really want to do it is, if you want it enough, you can do it. And now I look back on 30 years of students, and I see them all over the world, in every country, in every court, in every government, in every walk of life, and they're engaged. So it happens. It absolutely happens.
Thank you so much.
Great.